Please be seated. The court is now back in session. For this session, we will hear the testimony of TCCP 25, and the parties are reminded that the Chamber receives the request by Sari E237 through his counsel to waive his direct presence in the hearing of the testimony of 10 witnesses and 6 civil parties, including TCCP 25. And as reported by the treating doctor from the Khmer Soviet Friendship Hospital, dated 9 October 2012, on the 19th rather, he is being treated at the intensive care at that hospital, and as he requests to waive his direct presence in the hearing of the testimony of certain witnesses and civil parties due to his health concern, that he is being treated at the hospital, but that he is physically and psychologically able to observe the proceeding. The Chamber therefore decides to hear the testimony of this TCCP 25 in the absence of the presence of the accused based on the relevant internal rule of the ECCC. And we will proceed with his absence. Court officer, can you invite TCCP 25 into the courtroom? President, good morning, civil party. What is your name? Civil party. My name is Chum Sokha. Thank you. Question, Mr. Chum Sokha, can you tell the Chamber your date of birth? Response. I was born on the 1st of January 1955. Thank you. Question. Where is your place of birth? Response. I was born at Bong Kadai village, Damray Pun commune, Prevang district, Prevang province. Thank you. Question. Where is your current address? Response. I live in Prek Dat village, Prek Dat commune, Lược Đại District, Gondar Province. Thank you. Question. What is your father's name? Response. His name is Chum Sarun. Question. And your mother's? Response. Her name is Kut Pon. Question. What is your wife's name and how many children do you have? Response. My wife's name is Toj Kanya. We have 3 children, 1 son and 2 daughters. Thank you. Pursuant to Internal Rule 91 bis, the trial chamber will give the floor to the lead co-lawyers for civil parties to first question this civil party Chum Sukha. The lead co-lawyers for civil parties and the prosecutors have 1 full morning or afternoon session to question this civil party. Mr. Chum Sukha, you also reminded that in your capacity as a civil party, you have the right to describe to the chamber the situation and the suffering and harms incurred, both physical or psychological or material, which is directly or indirectly occurred during the regime and has an impact on you, and which leads you to become a civil party in correspondence with the facts alleged against the accused. That is for the events happened during the Democratic Cambodia regime. That is your right if you wish to do so. The floor is now given to the lead co-lawyers for civil parties to put questions to this civil party. You may proceed. Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honors. Tisrina, the lawyer for civil parties, is assigned to put questions to this civil party. We seek your permission, Mr. President. President, yes, we grant that permission. You may proceed. Tisrina. Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Chum Sukha. I have some questions for you. First, I'd like to ask you regarding the events occurred prior to 1975. Where were you before that date? Response. Before 1975, I lived at Po Chin Tong. Question. How old were you back then? Response. I was 20 years old. Question. What were your parents doing for a living back then? Response. My father was a military officer in Phnom Penh and my mother was a housewife. Question. Regarding events before 1975, my question is the following. Did you ever hear about the war between the Tribunal soldiers and the Khmer Rouge forces? If so, when did it start, if you can recall it? Response. Based on my recollection, it occurred in 1970 and continued up through 1975. Questioned. What were the situations like back then? Response. At that time, the Tribunal soldiers and the Khmer Rouge soldiers were fighting to control the area, and the fighting took place every day. We heard gunshots and shelling, and every day we saw wounded people and those people who died and people who were sent for treatment at the hospital. Question. Can you recall when the Khmer Rouge soldiers entered Phnom Penh? Response. On the morning of April 1975, at the location where I lived, at 9 a.m., I saw the Khmer Rouge soldiers enter the Phnom Penh. Questioned. Did the Khmer Rouge soldiers enter Phnom Penh from all directions or only from the direction where you live? Response. Based on the situations prior to the arrival of the Khmer Rouge soldiers, also based on the information broadcast and from the sound of the gunfires, they came from all directions around Phnom Penh. Questioned. When the Khmer Rouge soldiers entered Phnom Penh on 17 April 1975, what kind of situation did you observe? Response. Could you please repeat your question? Question. I rephrase my question then. On 17 April 1975, as you said, the Khmer Rouge soldiers entered Phnom Penh from all directions. My question is that at that time, what situation did you observe? Response. On 17 April 1975 at 9 a.m., I heard a gun fired from the west direction where I live, and I saw civilians went up and down. Some were fleeing, some were standing along the roadside. Majority of them were standing along the roadside. There were also the Tribunal soldiers who fled. They took off some of their uniforms. Some of them were holding the white flag along the road, including myself. And at 9 a.m., I saw the Khmer Rouge soldiers carrying all kinds of weapons, and some of them were wearing pants. Some of them were dirtied with mud and carrying guns and have the scarf on their head. They also have the grenade launchers, and also saw some grenades exploded near the concrete houses and the palm trees. And a bit later, I saw armored tanks and some military trucks. Question: what kinds of activities did the Khmer Rouge soldiers engage in, if you can recall? Response: after the troops went ahead from where I was standing, as I was standing with other people and some Lunar soldiers who were holding and waving their white flag, there was a Khmer Rouge soldier speaking on the loudspeaker announcing that the people living in Phnom Penh, you can do whatever you wish or engage in your business, and that Angkar would only prosecute the 7 traitors, including Lunol, Sermata, Cheng Heng, and a few others. They make such an announcement up and down on a loudspeaker at the place where I was standing. Question: let me go back a little bit regarding the shelling into Phnom Penh by the Khmer Rouge soldiers. Were there civilian casualties from the shelling? Response: a little bit before 9 a.m. there were shellings, but it was sporadic. The place where I lived, there were no casualties. However, the shelling was about 100 meters or 200 meters away from where I stood. I could see the smoke, but I did not see any casualty, as at that time I was concerned about my own safety. Question: what were you doing when the Khmer Rouge soldiers entered? Did your family members prepare themselves? Response: personally, I was standing along the roadside to receive and to congratulate the soldiers who just entered Phnom Penh. My father did the same, and my mother was cooking inside the house. Question: what was your feeling back then? Were you happy to receive the liberated soldiers? Response: the war had taken place for a few years before that date, so we were happy to see those soldiers coming to liberate the city, and that we would have peace, and that we would not have to face the war again, so that we stood there raising white flag to congratulate the liberation soldiers. So I was alongside with other civilians. Question: so people were greeting the liberation forces. Let me rephrase my question. When did they start chasing the people out of the city of Phnom Penh, if you can recall? Response: it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There was a group of soldiers who were speaking on a mobile loudspeaker that people had to leave Phnom Penh urgently because very soon there could be an aerial bombardment by the United States. So Angka requested all the people to leave Phnom Penh city for 3 days, and that they needed to leave the city urgently. Question: did you know the reason for the announcement by the Khmer Rouge forces for the people to leave the city? Response: as I just said, the reason for the people to leave Phnom Penh is that they had to leave the city because there would be aerial bombardment by the United States forces. And also they said that there were still enemies in the city and that the Angka needed to cleanse them from the city. At that time, Angka used the word Nyum, that is the word for it's a Buddhist term, as well as the word Samatmat or comrade, and they required us to leave the city for 3 days only. Question: at that time, did you want to leave based on the announcement, that is to leave for 3 days? Response: it was a difficult situation because there was no clear direction for us to go through. They only made an announcement for us to leave the city. My parents and my grandparents discussed among themselves that it would be difficult for us to leave and we did not know where to go through. But we decided that we could not stay because we were required by Angka to leave, as they made such an announcement repeatedly, so we had to leave. Question: when you left your house, which direction did you take and what the situation was like? Response: when my family left the house, we followed National Road number 4, that is the Po Chin Tong Road. And from my recollection, when we left, it was around 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the evening. At that time, it was not crowded. Maybe we were amongst the first to leave. Question: when you were on the road, what kind of situation did you observe? Response: initially, the situation that I never saw before was that I saw dead bodies along the roadside. But due to the darkness, and I could only see the dead bodies when there were the light from the vehicles, and I saw the smoke, I saw the damaged houses and the burnt bodies around the vicinity of the Po Chin Tong airport, also in front of the transport department. Question: You said that you traveled during the night along National Road number 4. Did you and your family happen to come through any incident, or what was the situation like in regards to your family? Response. We left along National Road number 4 towards the west direction. When we reached Chaom Chau, we were stopped by Angkar. They did not allow us to travel by National Road number 4 as there were still enemies, and we were instructed to leave following National Road number 3. Actually, during the daytime, when the Khmer Rouge soldiers entered Phnom Penh, they were looking for drivers so that the Khmer Rouge soldiers could travel and observe the situation in the city. And as my father knew how to drive, so he drove those liberation forces by driving that jeep. And when he returned with that jeep. And upon hearing the announcement by Angkar that we had to leave Phnom Penh, so we had some of our belongings. We put them onto that jeep together with my grandparents, and we left with that jeep. So as I said, we were amongst the first to leave the city. And then we rested near Seni vicinity for one night. We actually rested along the roadside. So we slept on the mat on the ground. That night, I saw a few people in civilian clothes coming to check the belongings of our family. And they requested to take away 2 sets of clothes. So we gave the clothes to them. We did not know what they wanted to do with the clothes, and we presumed that they were the Khmer Rouge soldiers. In the morning, on the next day, we continued on National Road number 3, but we could not start that car. So we pushed it along the road. We pushed it up to Kampong Tul, and we rested there, and we cooked our food. And if I can recall correctly, we stayed overnight there, and we left again next morning. My father and my uncle discussed whether we should bring along the car that we could not start because we had to have it across a stream. And we did not know about the situation on the other side of the stream. And then he could start the car. They could start the car again, and he reached the other side of the stream, and there was a checkpoint by the liberation forces on the other side that is still near the Kampong Tul, near the current petrol station. It was back then still a petrol station. And by that time, Angkar requested to take away that jeep vehicle from us, as they said that the jeep belongs to the imperialists, and that the jeep was a spoil of war, and that we would not be allowed to use it, and that we had to proceed on foot. And they also requested that my father and my uncle to register their names at a table near the petrol station. There was a work group there who questioned the evacuees. So men aged from 30 and above were questioned and registered on the list. So my father and my uncle by the name of Mir went to that table. As my mother, myself, my sister, my uncle, and my grandparents went ahead with little belongings that we had. So we proceeded on foot, and my father and uncle were left behind. We walked about 2 kilometers before my father and my uncle could catch up. I asked him why it took him so long, and he said that in fact I was supposed to be detained and tied, but I noticed that a lot of people were tied up, so I fled. Actually, they used a thread. It's a white and a red thread to tie people in a line, and that he asked us to hurry to go ahead. So at that Kampong Tul petrol station, they have a table to question the men, and they would detain some people there, as my father informed me when he joined us later. So we then arrived at Angkroj Pagoda. We stayed at that pagoda for several days, as my younger sister could not walk as her legs were swollen. At that Angkroj Pagoda where we stayed, Angka came to tell us that whoever wished to return to the native village, then Angka would allow us to go. So there was no need for us to proceed to anywhere but to our native village. And my father's village was in Tabong Kadai village, Damrai Pun commune, Prevang district, and Prevang province. Let me return a little bit. Before we arrived at that pagoda, I saw dead bodies who were covered alongside the national road, that road. It could be the patients. They were covered with old mat and leaves. And in fact, the next morning, the road was very crowded as more people were traveling along the road. And I concluded that the dead bodies belonged to those people who left Phnom Penh, and they could not make any burial ceremony as they were instructed by Angka just to proceed along the road. So after we rested at Angkroj Pagoda for a while, then we continued our journey. In fact, the entrance to Angkroj was along the national road, but it took a while to go to the pagoda itself along the railway track. Then we were instructed that we should proceed through the pagoda itself so that rice would be distributed by Angka. But we needed to register our names and occupations before the rice could be distributed. And for those people who used to work in Phnom Penh, they would be allowed to return later to work again in Phnom Penh. But as my father was aware of the situation back in Kampong Tul, he did not register his name. So we continued our journey. As for my sister, my younger sister, she still had a problem with her legs. So my mother had to exchange our jewelry and good clothes in exchange for my sister to be put onto a cart so that she needed not to walk. Then we reached a village near a lake in Bati, but I cannot recall the name of the village. We stayed there overnight, and next morning we continued our journey crossing the Bati temple. Then we went to Bang Khiang village. I then witnessed the liberation forces walked a line of people who were tied up with a white and red thread. So they were walked in the opposite direction, and there were two lines. Each was about more than 10 people, and one of the liberation force or soldier walked in front, and another soldier walked at the back of the line. And those people who were walked were tied by their thumb, and some were tied with their arms tied to their back. So when my father witnessed that, he was shocked, and he advised us to walk quickly. From my observation, my father was very afraid that he could be implicated. So I saw with my own eyes that people were walked. And later on, when I asked the villagers what the name of the village was, I was told that it was called Thmai village. It was where I walked past to Sang Phnom. So my family stayed at that lake for 1 or 2 hours, as we had to find some shell from the lake to cook. And then we rested for 1 night at the Sang mountain, and then we were instructed by Angka to move on, and we did so in the next morning. We then reached a pagoda near the riverside. It is now known as the Prek Toi Pagoda in Sang district. Council, let me interrupt you, Sivapati. There is one point in your description that I'd like you to specify further. You said that there was an announcement on the loudspeaker that people should leave the city for 3 days, and after that they could return. Is that a true statement by yours? Response: yes, that was indeed an announcement. Question: so when your family members as well as other people leaving the city for 3 days, did your family indeed intend to return to Phnom Penh? Response: in fact, my grandparents asked the comrade, that's the word they used back then, whether they could return, because we had left for more than 3 days. And then Angka said that we had to leave for 7 days because Angka had not cleansed the city properly yet. So then we continue walking further. We were not allowed to stay in one place. Question: who actually did not allow you to return to Phnom Penh, if you can recall? Were they civilian from the Lonol side, or who were they? Response: from I could observe, they wear a uniform with a car tire thong and a scarf. They could be an officer from the liberation soldiers. Because The areas that we walked past were the liberated zones. Thank you. Question. There is another point that you said that you saw people who were tied in a line. In fact, that your father told you that. Did he tell you whether they were ordinary civilians? Response. As my father told me, those people were the lunar soldiers. So when they questioned people and people told them that they were the lunar soldiers, then they would be detained and tied up. Question. You also said you saw a line of people walk from the opposite direction when you were walking. Were they civilians? Response. Some of them were wearing military uniforms, some were wearing civilian clothing, civilian shirt, pants, and some even wore the underwear, as I observed. Question. When you saw those people tied up and walk in one line, were they led by a militia or were they led by somebody in particular? Response. As I stated earlier, there were only two people controlling the line. There was one leading the line of those people who were tied up. They were wearing a beret. They were wearing black uniforms and car tire thongs, and they were also holding a gun. There was only one person carrying a gun, that is the one who walked behind. Question. Can you recall when did you see that? In what year? Response. It was in 1975 during the fall of Phnom Penh, maybe about a fortnight after the fall of Phnom Penh, between 10 days to a fortnight. My next question is in regards to your journey and the food. What was the journey like? Was it comfortable? What was it like for you, your family, and for other people? Response. It was very difficult for my family, in particular for the resting place, because wherever we stopped, we would rest on the ground. We could not go into the people's houses. We could only rest along the roadside. And if we could not find drinking water or water to cook the rice, we had to try to locate a pond or a lake nearby so that we can use the water. And we could carry some rice with us, but we needed to find water to cook the rice. Question. Regarding your journey out of the city, were there people guarding along the road when you traveled? Response. No, there were no people guarding along the road. If we were to be instructed, suddenly there appear 2 or 3 people coming to make such announcement. Sometimes I observe they carried a gun, or sometimes they carried a knife. And they were wearing a black uniform. Question: regarding the prohibition of the circulation of currency, which is the next topic, during the initial evacuation, did they make an announcement on the prohibition of the currency circulation? Response: as I recall, when we left Phnom Penh, they actually stopped using the money at the Slang Pagoda in Kondasteng district. I saw a Chinese transporting a truck full of pig, and then that Chinese sold the pork near that pagoda and sold the songs, and he got a lot of money. And in late afternoon, I heard the announcement that there would be no circulation of money anymore. Then that was the time that I concluded that there was no longer money circulation, and that happened about 2 or 3 days after the fall of Phnom Penh.
Counsel, do you still recall who actually banned the circulation of money? Response: people at the base, people whom I talked about wearing uniforms and red checked scarves. They said money no longer was circulated. Although you would like to buy something, you would never be able to exchange the commodities with the money anymore. Question: what about the people's feeling at that time? Response: at Wat Slang, we noted that there were a lot of people. People did not express very well. They only whispered to one another about the banning of the money. That's all. They did not say this out loud. Question: you talked about Slang Pagoda. Where is it? Response: Slang Pagoda is in Kondasteng district. I don't know which location. It is just near Kampong Tul vicinity. Question: as to your trip, when you were walking on the roads, can you tell the chamber, please, at which points were people stopped and checked about their backgrounds? For example, whether they were affiliated with the Lonol regime. Response: as indicated, we were stopped and checked when we reached Kampong Tul location. My father had learned about this in advance. That's why he escaped before he was checked. He knew that if he didn't do so, he would be arrested after people learned about his background. We then went all the way to Bong Day village, and more thorough checking was conducted there, and my father's background was then revealed. And 10 days after we approached that village, the cousin of my brother and his friends had already been taken to the study sessions. Question: how long did it take for you to travel all the way to your hometown after the evacuation? Response: from Phnom Penh to my hometown, including the time to rest and travels, it took us about a month. At first, we did not go all the way to Bong Kadai village. Our family, indeed, was made to stay at Bang Antung of Me Sang district before we headed to my hometown. After that, Angka made an announcement saying that wherever we were from or belonged, then we could go there after all. And my father and other members of the other families also took the advantage of such permission to go to our respective hometown. Question: when you reached your hometown, what was your impression about the situation back then as opposed to that in Phnom Penh? Response: in Bong Kadai village, my first impression was about the communication, our relations with our relatives, morality. My father used to be loved and liked by everyone in the village. But by the time I arrived in the village, this time indeed, an uncle of mine who loved my father very much in the previous time came to my father and tapped him on the shoulder and asked him how he was. Normally, he could never do that. He should have paid great respect to my father by clasping his both hands as a gesture of respect. He only asked this time my father just this question, and that's all. And other people did not show some kind of affection or relation to my father. So people were rather quiet and reserved. Question: when you got to your hometown, how was your stay arranged? Did you have to find your own place to stay, or was all this organized for you? Response: at first, my father got to a house of his cousin, and he talked to Angka, asking Angka to allow him and the family to stay at that big house. And we were allowed to do so. Question: you talked about Angka and that their permission was and you asked for. There was a time when Angkar was asked for permission to stay in the house, but please be more precise. Was Angkar already established before you went there? Response. When I got there, we learned that cooperatives had already been established because I noted that there were heads of the cooperatives and group leaders, and our family member was made to join each different group. For example, my parent would be asked to live in a separate group as opposed to mine. Question. What kind of work were you tasked with doing? And what did your parents do? Response. Upon arriving, the head of the cooperatives convened a meeting where all the evacuees came, and we were instructed on how we had to do our work to dig canals. And my mother had to work elsewhere. My grandfather was tasked with weaving, the craft work of the rope, and my nephews were tasked with collecting cow dung. So everyone had different tasks. We met only during lunch break briefly. After that, we had to break up and only to meet again when night fell. Question. You talked about the cooperatives. Can you please tell the chamber whether you recall any organizational structure of the cooperatives and the Khmer Rouge?
Excuse me, Your Honor.
The President, Counsel, you may proceed.
I apologize for interrupting. This is in line with the intervention I made on Friday. Perhaps what I need, or what we all need, is a clarification. As I understand it, the crime bases, the crime sites, the alleged crimes that are at issue in this trial are two discrete population movements and one distinct security center. Not what happened after a population movement when people were settled. That's how I understand it. And you will correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that the crimes that have been alleged with respect to the population transfer are those alleged crimes that may have happened during the transfer and not once those individuals were resettled. That's my understanding. So if that's correct, I would object on relevance at this stage.
Counsel Tisrina, with Mr. President Liu, I would like to respond to this submission by counsel for the accused. My question is relevant to the facts. The President has already made it clear that the civil party is allowed to give testimony or to take the stand on the facts during the period of 1975 to 1977. So the question is relevant to those facts, and that the question is also relevant to the closing order concerning the structure of the lower level of the Khmer Rouge, and I can say that the fragment, the segment of this trial covers the scope of my line of questioning. I believe that the chamber will allow me to continue putting questions, the kind of questions I put to the civil party, and allow the civil party to respond. And with this, my colleague also would like to have a few words as well. The President, National Legal Lawyer for the Civil Party, you may proceed. Counsel Pick Ong. Thank you, Mr. President and Your Honors. The scope of this trial is more about the first and second phase of the evacuation or forced transfer. This scope is not limited to where people could be evacuated to. What we are discussing before us today is about the evacuation, and we are here with a civil party who has suffered or who was perhaps intimidated because he was evacuated from the city to a countryside or to a base, and the base that was the place where the base people lived, and then the new people came in. So these facts involve the recollection of this civil party, and he is best to take the stand. Counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia, you may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. If I could just reply very briefly. My understanding was that the civil parties would indeed be permitted to talk about the harm they suffered in their statement at the end of their testimony, and that pending a decision on the written motion that's about to be filed by the civil party co-lawyers, that pending a decision on that, they will be given a wide latitude with respect to the statement of their suffering that they make at the end, as we saw this morning with the previous civil party. However, with respect to the examination by the parties, it is my understanding, and I do think I'm correct, that it's to be limited to the crime base. And the crime base at issue in this trial, there are three. The first population movement, the second population movement, and the recently added security center. So clearly this witness's testimony, the civil party's testimony, falls within that first area, the evacuation from Phnom Penh. We're beyond that now. We're now into an area where we've arrived at the base where this civil party ended up at the conclusion of the evacuation. It's no longer relevant, factually. For the examination. Of course, at the end, pending that decision, when it comes time for this individual, this gentleman, to speak about his harm, then he will be given the latitude that Your Honor mentioned, that Judge Lavergne mentioned this morning. So that's our position. We're into crime-based witnesses now. We should stick to the facts that are relevant with respect to those crime bases. This is not a civil party. This civil party has not been called to give testimony about administrative structures, about communication structures, about military structures. This individual, this civil party, has been called to give testimony about the evacuation of Phnom Penh. So, again, just to be clear, that is the limit of the relevance, I would say.
The President, I would like now to hand over to Judge Cartwright. Please, you may proceed.
Thank you, President. Counsel for the civil parties, the Chamber's ruling is that the primary focus of any information from civil parties, or indeed any witness, must be on case 002/01. If there is other background information, it must be kept to the absolute minimum, and we ask you to rephrase your question to the civil party accordingly. Thank you.
Counsel the Srina, I thank you very much, Your Honor. I would like to rephrase the question as follows. Mr. Chum Sokha, when you reached your hometown, was there any arrangement made concerning how your families would be treated? For example, were you treated as the newcomers, or were you treated as the base people?
Objection, Your Honor. Again, I think, and I'm just trying to be very rigorous in terms of how we're proceeding here. If the crime base is, and I'm using that term loosely, I think everyone understands what I'm saying. If the crime base is the evacuation of Phnom Penh, and the crimes are alleged to have been committed during the evacuation of Phnom Penh, then what happened, if anything, once people were settled at the end of that alleged evacuation is wholly irrelevant. It's wholly irrelevant. Judge Cartwright mentioned background. I would say that background would relate to things that happened prior to the evacuation, on the way, during, en route, as we would say. But once we've reached the end of the line, we're moving into a different area. What happened at this particular location, this civil parties village, what happened there, that's another area, that's another crime site, that's another issue. That's not the evacuation of Phnom Penh. The evacuation of Phnom Penh is from Phnom Penh to wherever an individual may have ended up. And again, I'm just thinking about what happened in this courtroom on Friday. I think rigor is what we need in this courtroom. Rigor, a rigorous application of rules, not the
The President, Judge Cartwright, you may now proceed.
Mr. Iannuzzi, you were cut off because the Chamber fully understood your point. There was no need to keep expanding on it and repeating it. So I will remind the counsel for the civil party that you are to focus only on the facts in case 002/01. Other information that falls outside that factual basis must be kept to the absolute minimum. We are only trying the facts in this case. So please make sure that your civil party does not, in response to your questions, expand beyond that framework. Have I made myself clear?
Counsel Serena, Your Honor, I may wish to seek some clarification on this, please. My view concerning the facts at issue in the scope of case file 002/01 covers the administrative structure and both the upper echelon administrative structures and lower, and also the population movements first and second stage. That's what I understood from the instruction by the chamber. In light of that, I still feel that the questions I am putting are relevant. We may ask a question: if the evacuation did not take place, he would not be forced to move to his hometown. So I am still convinced that he was forced to move to the location where he did not want to go. And I would like to ask the chamber whether I am allowed to put these questions concerning the cause and effect of the evacuation of the population from Phnom Penh.
What your questions seemed to be leading towards was what happened to this civil party after the evacuation of Phnom Penh. That is not relevant unless what happened to him falls within the current facts in case 002/01. So I hope that this is now clear, and I see Madam Simino-4 may be about to offer some guidance as well. Thank you. I would appreciate that.
Oui, je vous remercie, Madame le Juge.
Thank you, Your Honor. What I think is that my learned colleague is saying that as of time, insofar as we are looking at forced transfer 1 and forced transfer 2, it is impossible not to look at what happened between the two transfers, because transfer number 2 is necessarily related to transfer number 1 and also to the intermediate period. So it is indispensable that for us to consider the two types of transfers, we should consider the question or the issue of the absolute minimum referred to by you, the judge. So these issues are absolutely indispensable when we are talking of transfer number 2.
The President, International Co-Prosecutor, if you would like to have a few words on this, you may now have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I tried to rise earlier before you took your decision, but it was not possible for me to make my submission then. I would like to add a point, because it appears that Nguyen Chia's defense is voluntarily restricting or circumscribing the scope of this trial. It is nevertheless interesting to know with regard to the immediate consequences of the forced transfers. What I mean is that we should know what became of those persons who were regarded as 17 April people. On their arrival were measures taken against them to distinguish them from the others. And what happened to them? As it is important to know what happened to civil servants and long-haul soldiers when they were identified as such in the villages in which they arrived, if they hadn't been discovered before. These are immediate consequences of the evacuation. That is the first phase of the forced transfers. And this trial is about that. I am speaking after your decision, but it appears that insofar as we are dealing with those issues, we should be tolerant and flexible to allow civil parties to answer questions on those issues.
The President, Council, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just two brief points. One, a general point. I don't think the severance order said anything about population movements 1 and 2 and subsequent events and what happened after the fact. If we move into that area, we might as well just try the case as originally pleaded by the co-prosecutors. The severance order was very clear. Population movements 1 and 2. Recently, we've had a third crime site added. We can't say that because Thursday follows Wednesday, it's relevant to the week. If the week is cut off at Wednesday, then the week ends at Wednesday. That's my general point. My specific point, with respect to what my colleague for the civil parties mentioned about linking the two population movements, I would accept that if the facts bear that out, but anyone who's read this civil party statement will know that this civil party ended in this particular village and stayed there, according to the statement, until the end of 1978. So I accept that in theory, I accept that formulation in theory if the civil party lawyers are able to make a connection to the second population transfer. That's absolutely fine. I could hardly object to that. But it seems to me, at least from the face of this civil party statement, that there is no connection, factually, to the second population transfer. So I would object on that grounds. So again, I'm not going to repeat myself, Judge Cartwright, but I do think we need a measure of clarity in dealing with the witnesses going forward. Thank you.
The President, since it is now appropriate time for lunch adjournment, the Chamber will adjourn for now until 1:30. Court officer is now instructed to assist the civil party during the lunch adjournment and have him return to the courtroom by 1:30 p.m. Counsel, you may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. My last point for this morning is standard application. Nunchia is suffering from a headache, a backache, and a general lack of concentration, and for those three reasons would like to retire to the holding cell for the afternoon. Thank you very much.
The President, thank you, Counsel. The Chamber notes the request by Mr. Nunchia through his counsel, in which Mr. Nunchia has requested that he be allowed to observe the proceedings from his holding cell due to his health concern, that he cannot remain seated in this courtroom. The Chamber therefore grants such request and ask that counsel for Mr. Nunchia submit such a waiver to the Chamber, the waiver that is signed or given thumbprint by Mr. Nunchia. Mr. Nunchia is now allowed to observe the proceedings from his holding cell. and the AV unit is now instructed to ensure that the AV link is connected to Mr. Noonchie's holding cell so that Mr. Noonchie can observe the proceedings from there for the remainder of the day. Security personnel are now instructed to bring Mr. Noonchie and Khieu Samphan to their respective holding cell and have Mr. Khieu Samphan return to the courtroom when the next session resumes. The court is adjourned.
សូមគោរពឈរ